the little friend.
This light is here to keep you warm. This light is here to strong. I need this, all the things to say. You say
Alright, bros, we're back with Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. The Little Friend. And we are on page 373, chapter 6. In the hubbub following the accident, no one had stopped to consider that anything might be seriously wrong with any of the old ladies, apart from a few cuts and bruises, and Edie's bloody nose, which looked worse than it was. Everyone was more shaken up than hurt, and the paramedics had checked them out with irritating thoroughness before permitting them to leave. Not a scratch on this one, said the smart-aleck ambulance attendant who had assisted Libby, all white hair and pearls and powder pink dress, from the crumpled car. Libby had seemed stunned. The worst of the collision had been on her side, but though she kept pressing the base of her neck with her fingertips gingerly, as if to locate a pulse, she fluttered her hand and said, "Oh, don't worry about me." When, against the protest of the paramedics, Edie climbed out of the back of the ambulance to see about her sisters. Everybody had a stiff neck. Edie's neck felt as though it had been cracked like a bullwhip. Adelaide, pacing in a circle by the Oldsmobile, kept pinching her ears to see if she still had both earrings and exclaiming, "It's a wonder we're not dead. Edith, it's a wonder you didn't kill us." But after everyone was checked for concussions and broken bones, why, thought Edie, why hadn't she insisted that those idiots take Libby's blood pressure? She was a trained nurse. She knew about such things. In the end, the only one the paramedics wanted to carry to the hospital was Edie, which was infuriating because Edie wasn't hurt, nothing broken, no internal injuries, and she knew it. She had permitted herself to be caught up in argument. Nothing was the matter with her but her ribs, which she had cracked on the steering wheel, and from her days as an army nurse, Edie knew that there was nothing wrong in the world to do for cracked ribs except to tape them up and send the soldier on his way, pardon. But you've got a cracked rib, ma'am, said the other paramedic, not the smart aleck, but the one who had a great big head like a pumpkin. Yes, I'm aware of that, Edie had practically screamed at him. But ma'am, intrusive hands stretching towards her, you'd better let us take you to the hospital, ma'am. Why? All they do is tape me up and charge me $100. For $100, I can tape up my own ribs. I don't know what YNW is. An emergency room visit is going to run you a whole lot more than $100, said the smart aleck, leaning on the hood of Edie's poor, smashed car. The car, her heart sank every time she looked at it. The x-rays shown. The x-rays alone will run you $75. By this time, a slight crowd had gathered, busybodies from the branch bank, mostly giggling little gum-chewing girls with teased hair and brown lipstick. Tat, who signaled to the police car to stop by shaking her yellow pocketbook at it, climbed into the back seat of the wrecked Oldsmobile, even though the horn was blaring, and sat there with Libby for most of the business with the policeman and the other driver, which had taken forever. He was a spry and irritating little old know-it-all man named Lyle Pettit Rixey, very thin, with long, pointy shoes and a hooked nose like a jack-in-the-box, and a delicate way of lifting his knees high in the air when he walked. He seemed very proud of the fact that he was from Atala County. I don't know where that is. Also of his name, which he took pleasure at repeating in full. He kept pointing at Edie with a querulous, bony finger and saying, "That woman there." He made it sound as if Edie was drunk or an alcoholic. The woman ran right out in front of me. That woman got no business driving an automobile. Edie turned loftily and stood with her back to him as she answered the officer's questions. The accident was her fault. She had refused to yield, and the best that she could do was accept the blame with dignity. Her glasses were broken, and from where she stood in the shimmering heat, that woman sure picked herself a hot day to dart out in front of me, complained Mr. Rixey to the ambulance attendants. Libby and Tat were little more than pink and yellow blurs in the back seat of the wrecked Oldsmobile. Edie blotted her forehead with a damp tissue. At Tribulation every Christmas there had been dresses in 4 different colors laid out under the tree: pink for Lily, blue for Edie, yellow for Tat, and lavender for baby Adelaide. Colored pen wipers, colored ribbons, and letter paper. Blood china dolls, identical, but for their dresses, each a different pastel. "Did you," said the policeman, "or did you not execute a U-turn?" "I did not. I turned around right here in the parking lot. From the highway, a car mirror flashed distractingly in the corner of Edie's vision, and at the same time, an inexplicable memory from childhood leapt up in her mind. Teddy's old tin doll, dressed in draggled yellow, lying windmill-legged in the dust of Tribulation's kitchen yard, beneath the fig trees where the chickens sometimes escaped to scratch. Edie herself had never played with dolls, never been the slightest bit interested in them, but she could see the tin doll now with a curious clarity, her body brown cloth, her nose glinting a macabre metallic silver, where the paint had rubbed away. How many years had Teddy dragged that battered thing with its metallic death's head around the yard? How many years since Edie had thought of that eerie little face with the nose missing? The policeman interrogated Edie for half an hour. With his droning voice and his mirror sunglasses, it was slightly like being interrogated by the fly in the Vincent Price horror movie of the same name. Edie, shading her eyes with her hand, tried to keep her mind on his questions, but her eyes kept straying to the cars flashing past on the bright highway, and all she could think of was Taddy's ghastly old doll with the silver nose. What on earth had that thing been called? For the life of her, Edie couldn't remember. Taddy hadn't talked plain until she went to school. All Tat's dolls had ridiculous-sounding names, names she made up out of her head, names like Grice and Lilium and Artemo. The little girls from the branch bank got bored, and, inspecting their nails, twirling their hair around their fingertips, drifted back inside. Adelaide, whom Edie blamed bitterly for the whole business, she and her Sanka, appeared very put out, and stood a cool distance from the scene as if she weren't part of it, talking to a noisy choir friend, Mrs. Carteret, who had pulled over to see what was going on. At some point, she'd hopped in the car with Mrs. Carteret and driven off without even telling Edie. "We're driving to McDonald's to get a sausage and biscuit," she'd called out to Tat and poor Libby. McDonald's. And to top it all off, when the insect-faced policeman finally gave Edie permission to leave, her poor old car had, of course, refused to start, and she had been forced to square her shoulders and walk back into the horrible, chilly branch bank, back in front of all the saucy little tellers, to ask if she could use the telephone. And all the while, Libby and Tat had sat uncomplaining in the back of the Oldsmobile in the frightful heat. Their cab hadn't taken long to come, for from where she stood at the manager's desk in front, talking on the phone to the man from the garage, Edie watched the two of them walking to the taxi through the plate glass window, arm in arm, picking their way across the gravel in their Sunday shoes. She rapped on the glass. Tat in the glare turned halfway and raised an arm, and all of a sudden the name of Taddy's old doll came to Edie. So suddenly she laughed out loud. "What?" said the garage man. The manager, wall-eyed behind thick glasses, glanced up at Edie as if she were crazy, but she didn't care. Lycobus, of course. That was the tin doll's name, Lycobus, who was naughty and sassed her mother. Lycobus, who invited Adelaide's dolls to a tea party and served them only water and radishes. When the tow truck finally came, Edie accepted a ride home from the driver. It was the first time she'd been in a truck since World War II. The cab was high, and climbing up inside it with her cracked ribs had not been fun. But as the judge had been so fond of reminding his daughters, beggars can't be choosers. By the time she got home, it was nearly 1 o'clock. Edie hung up her clothes. Not until she was undressing did she remember that the suitcases were still in the trunk of the Oldsmobile, and took a cool bath. Sitting on the side of her bed in her brassiere and panty waist, she sucked in her breath and taped up her ribs as best she could. Then she had a glass of water and an Emperim with coating left over from some dental work, and put on a kimono and lay down on the bed. Much later, she'd been awakened by a telephone call. For a moment, she thought the thin little voice on the other end was the children's mother. "Charlotte?" she barked, and then, when there was no answer, "Who is calling, please?" "This is Allison. I'm over at Libby's. She seems upset." "I don't blame her," said Edie. The pain of sitting up suddenly had caught her unawares. And she took her breath in sharply. "Now's not the time for her to entertain company. You ought not to be over there bothering her, Allison. She doesn't seem tired. She says she has to pickle some beets." "Pickling beets?" Edie snorted. "I'd be mighty upset if I had to pickle beets this afternoon, but she says, 'You run home and let Libby rest,'" said Edie. She was a little groggy from her pain pill, and for fear of being questioned about the accident, the policeman had suggested her eyes might be at fault. There had been talk of a test, a revoked license. She was anxious to cut the conversation short. In the background, a fretful murmur. "What's that?" "She's worried. She asked me to call you, Edie. I don't know what to do. Please come over and see." "What on earth for?" said Edie. "Put her on." "She's in the next room." Talk indistinguishable. Then Allison's voice returned. "She says she has to go to town, and she doesn't know where her shoes and stockings are. Tell her not to worry. The suitcases are in the trunk of the car. Has she had her nap?" More mumbled talk, enough to test Edie's patience. "Hello?" she said loudly. "She says she's fine, Edie, but..." Libby always said she was fine. When Libby had scarlet fever, she said she was fine. But she won't sit down, said Allison. Her voice seemed far away, as if she hadn't brought the receiver properly to her mouth again. She's standing in the living room. Though Allison continued to speak and Edie continued to listen, the sentence had ended and another began before Edie realized all of a sudden that she hadn't understood a word. I'm sorry, she said curtly. You'll have to speak up. And before she could scold Allison for mumbling, there was a sudden ruckus at the front door. Tap, 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 a series of brisk little knocks. Edie rewrapped her kimono, tied the sash tight, and peered down the hall. There stood Roy Dow, grinning like an opossum with his little gray saw teeth. He tipped her a sprightly wave. Quickly, Edie ducked her head back into the bedroom. The vulture, she thought. I'd like to shoot him. He looked as pleased as Punch. Allison was saying something else. Listen, I've got to let you go, she said briskly. I've got company on the porch and I'm not dressed. She says she has to meet a bride at the train station, said Allison distinctly. After a moment, Edie, who did not like to admit she was hard of hearing and who was used to galloping straight over conversational non sequiturs, took a deep breath so that her ribs hurt and said, Tell Lib I said lie down. If she wants me to, I'll walk over and take her blood pressure and give her a tranquilizer as soon as tap, 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 tap. As soon as I get rid of him, she said, and then said goodbye. She threw a shawl over her shoulders, stepped into her slippers, and ventured into the hall. Through the leaded glass panel of the door, Mr. Dial, mouth open in an exaggerated pantomime of delight, held up what looked like a fruit basket wrapped in yellow cellophane. When he saw that she was in her robe, he gave a gesture of dismayed apology, eyebrows going up in the middle in an inverted V, and with extravagant lip movement, pointed at the basket and mouth, Sorry to bother you, just a little something. I'll leave it right here. After a moment's indecision, Edie called on a cheery, changed note, Wait a minute, be right out. Then her smile souring as soon as she turned her back. She hurried to her room, closed the door, and plucked the house dress from her closet. Zip up the back, dab, dab, rouge on both cheeks. Puff of powder in the nose. She ran a brush through her hair, wincing at the pain in her raised arm, and gave herself a quick glance in the mirror before she opened the door and went down the hall to meet him. Well, I declare, she said stiffly when Mr. Dial presented her with the basket. I hope I didn't disturb you, said Mr. Dial, turning his head cozily to look at her from the opposite eye. Dorothy ran into Susie Carteret at the grocery store, and she told her all about the accident. I've been saying for years, he laid a hand on her arm for emphasis, that they need a stoplight at that intersection. Years. I phoned out at the hospital, but they said you hadn't been admitted, thank goodness. A hand to his chest, he rolled his eyes heavenward in gratitude. Well, goodness, said Edie, mollified. Thank you. Listen, that's the most dangerous intersection in the county. I'll tell you what's going to happen. It's a shame, but somebody's going to have to get killed out there before the Board of Supervisors sits up and takes notice. Killed. It was with surprise that Edie found herself softening to Mr. Dial's manner, which was most agreeable, particularly as he seemed convinced that the accident could in no way have been her fault. And when he gestured out to the new Cadillac parked at the curb, just a courtesy, thought you might need a loaner for a couple of days, she was not nearly so hostile at the sly liberty as she would have been even a few minutes before, and walked out with him obligingly as he went over all the features, leather seats, tape deck, power steering. This beauty's just been on the lot for 2 days, and I have to say that the minute I saw it, I thought, now here is the perfect car for Miss Edith. To watch his demonstrations of the automatic windows and so forth was oddly satisfying, considering that only a short while ago some folks had been so presumptuous as to suggest that Edie should not drive at all. On he talked. Edie's pain pill was wearing off. She tried to cut him short, but Mr. Dial, pressing his advantage, for he knew from the tow truck driver that the Oldsmobile was bound for the junkyard, began to throw out incentives, $500 knocked off the list price. And why? Palm spread, not out of the goodness of my heart. No, ma'am, Miss Edith. I'll tell you why, because I'm a good businessman, and because Dial Chevrolet wants your business. In the rich summer light, as he stood explaining why he would also extend the extended warranty, Edie, with a stab of pain in her breastbone, had a sharp, ugly, nightmarish flash of impending old age, aching joints, blurry eyes, constant aspirin aftertaste in the back of her throat, peeling paint, leaky roofs, taps that dripped, and cats that peed on the carpet, and lawns that never got mowed, and time enough to stand in the yard for hours listening to any con artist or shyster or helpful stranger who drifted down the pike. How often had she driven out the tribulation to find her father the judge, sitting in the driveway with some salesman or unscrupulous contractor, some grinning gypsy tree pruner who would later claim that the quote was per limb, not per tree. Companionable Judases in Florsheim shoes, offering him girly magazines and nips of whiskey with all kinds of ground floor opportunities, incredible overrides in between, mineral rights, protected territories, enough no-risk investments, and chances of a lifetime to finally relieve the poor old fellow of all he owned, including his birthplace. With an increasingly black and hopeless feeling, Edie listened. What was the use of fighting? She, like her father, was a stoic old pagan. Though she attended church as a civic and social duty, she did not actually believe a word of what was said there. Everywhere were green graveyard smells, mown grass, lilies, and turned dirt. Pain pierced her ribs every time she took a breath, and she could not stop thinking of the onyx and diamond brooch inherited from her mother, which she'd packed like a stupid old woman in an unlocked suitcase, which now lay in the unlocked trunk of a wrecked car across town. All my life, she thought, I have been robbed. Everything I ever loved has been taken from me. And somehow, Mr. Dial's companionable presence was a strange comfort. His flushed face, the ripe smell of his aftershave, and his whinnying, porpoise laugh, his fussy manner at odds with the solid ripeness of his chest beneath the starched shirt was queerly reassuring. I always did think he was a nice-looking man, thought Edie. Roy Dial had his faults, but at least he wasn't so impertinent as to suggest that Edie was incompetent to drive. I will drive, she had thundered at the pipsqueak eye doctor only a week earlier. I don't care if I kill everybody in Mississippi. And while she stood listening to Mr. Dial talk about the car, laying his plump finger on her arm, just one more thing to tell her, and one more after that. And then, by the time she was thoroughly tired of him, asking, what would I have to say to make you my customer this instant? Tell me what I have to say in order to get your business. While Edie, strangely powerless for once to disengage herself, stood and listened to his pitch, Libby, after becoming sick in a basin, lay down on her bed with a cool cloth on her forehead and slipped into a coma from which she was never to awake. A stroke, that's what it was. When she'd suffered the first one, no one knew. Any other day, Odeon would have been there, but Odine had the week off because of the trip. When Libby finally answered the door, it had taken her a while, so long that Allison thought that maybe she was asleep. She wasn't wearing her glasses, and her eyes were a little blurry. She looked at Allison as if she was expecting someone else. Are you all right? Allison asked. She'd heard all about the wreck. Oh, yes, said Libby distractedly. She let Allison in and then wandered away into the back of the house like she was looking for something she'd misplaced. She seemed fine except for a spotchy bruise on her cheekbone. The color of grape jelly spread thin, and her hair not as tidy as she usually liked it. Allison said, glancing around, can't you find your newspaper? The house was spanking clean, floors freshly mopped, everything dusted, and even the sofa cushions plumped and properly placed. Somehow, the very tidiness of the house had kept Allison from realizing that anything might be wrong. Sickness in her own house had to do with disorder, with grimy curtains and gritty bedsheets, drawers left open, and crumbs on the table. After a brief search, Allison found the newspaper folded to the crossword, with her glasses sitting on top of it, on the floor by Libby's chair, and carried them into the kitchen, where Libby sat at the table, smoothing the tablecloth with one hand in a tight, repetitive circle. Here's your puzzle, said Allison. The kitchen was uncomfortably bright. Despite the sun pouring through the curtains, the overhead lights were on for some reason, as if it were a dark winter afternoon and not the middle of summer. Did you want me to get you a pencil? No, I can't work that foolish thing, Libby said, fretfully, pushing the paper aside. The letters keep sliding off the page. What I need to do is go ahead and get started on my beats. Beats? Unless I start now, they won't be ready in time. The little bride's coming into town on number 4. What bride? Said Allison after a slight pause. She'd never heard of the number 4, whatever that was. Everything was bright and unreal. Ida Rue had left only an hour before, just like any other Friday, except that she wasn't coming back on Monday or ever again, and she'd taken nothing but the red plastic glass she drank out of. In the hallway on the way out, she had refused the carefully wrapped cuttings in the box of presents, which she said was too heavy to carry. I ain't need all that, she said, cheerily, turning to look Allison straight in the eye, and her tone was that of someone offered a button or a piece of licked candy by a toddler. What you think I need all that nonsense for? Allison, stunned, fought not to cry. Ida, I love you, she said. Well, said Ida thoughtfully, I love you too. It was terrible. It was too terrible to be happening, and yet there they stood by the front door. A sharp lump of grief rose in Allison's throat to see how meticulously Ida folded the green check, lying face up on the hall table, $20 and no hundreds, making sure that both edges were lined up and perfectly even before she creased it with a zip of thumb and forefinger. Then she unsnapped her little black purse and put it in. I can't live anymore on $20 a week, she said. Her voice was quiet and natural, yet all wrong at the same time. How could they possibly be standing in the hall like this? How could this moment be real? I love y'alls, but that's the way it is. I'm getting old. She touched his cheek. Y'all be good now. Tell little Ugh? Ugh, I love her. Ugh for ugly was what Ida called Harriet when she misbehaved. Then the door closed and she was gone. I expect, said Libby, and Allison, with slight alarm, noticed that Libby was looking around the kitchen floor in a jerky way, as if she saw a moth fluttering by her feet. She won't be able to find them when she gets there. Excuse me, said Allison, beets. Pickled beets. Oh, I wish somebody would help me, said Libby, with a plaintive, half-comic roll of her eyes. Do you need me to do something for you? Where's Edith? Said Libby, and her voice was strangely clipped and crisp. She'll do something for me. Allison sat down at the kitchen table and tried to get her attention. Do you have to make the beets today? She said, Lib. All I know is what they told me. Allison nodded and sat for a moment in the too bright kitchen, wondering how to proceed. Sometimes Libby came home from missionary society or circle with strange and very specific demands for green stamps or old glasses frames or Campbell's soup labels, which the Baptist home in Honduras redeemed for cash, for popsicles sticks or old Lux detergent bottles, for crafts at the church bazaar. Tell me who to call, she said at last. I'll call and tell them that you were in an accident this morning. Somebody else can bring the beets. Abruptly, Libby said, Edith will do something for me. She stood and walked back into the next room. Do you want me to call her? Said Allison, peering after her. Libby. She had never heard Libby speak quite so brusquely. Edith will straighten it all out, said Libby in a weak, peevish voice that was quite unlike herself. And Allison went to the telephone, but she was still reeling from Ida's departure. And what she had not been able to put into words to Edie was how altered Libby seemed, how confused, how strangely collapsed in her expression. The shame-faced way she kept picking at the side of her dress, Allison, stretching the cord as far as it would go, craned to look in the next room as she spoke, stammering in her consternation. The white, wispy edges of Libby's hair had seemed to burn red, hair so thin that Allison could see Libby's rather large ears through it. Edie interrupted Allison before she was finished talking. You run home and let Libby rest, she said. Wait, said Allison, and then called into the next room. Libby, here's Edie. Will you come and talk to her? What's that? Edie was saying. Hello? Sunlight pooled on the dining room table, puddles of bright sentimental gold. Watery coins of light, reflected from the chandelier, shimmered on the ceiling. The whole place had seemed dazzling, lit up like a ballroom. And at her edges, Libby glowed hot red like an amber. or an ember, pardon, and the afternoon sun which poured around her in a corona carried in its shadow a darkness that felt like something burning. I'm worried about her, Allison said despairingly. Please come over. I can't figure out what she's talking about. Listen, I've got to go, said Edie. I've got company at the door and I'm not dressed. And then she had hung up. Allison stood by the telephone a moment longer, trying to gather her thoughts, and then hurried into the next room to see about Libby, who turned to her with a staring, fixed expression. We had a pair of ponies, she said, little bays. I'm going to call the doctor. You will not, said Libby so firmly that Allison buckled immediately to her adult tone of authority. You will do no such thing. You're sick, Allison started to cry. No, I'm fine. It's just that they ought to have come and got me by now, said Libby. Where are they? It's getting on in the afternoon, and she put her hand in Allison's, her little dry, papery hand, and looked at her as if she were expecting to be taken somewhere. The odor of lily and tuberose, overpowering in the hot funeral parlor, made Harriet's stomach flutter queasily whenever the fan revolved and blew a draft of it in her direction. In her best Sunday dress, the white dress with daisies, she sat dim-eyed on a scroll. Can't grab the page. On a scroll. Like a skip record here. On a scroll-backed settee, the carvings poked her between the shoulder bones. Her dress was too tight in the bodice, which only increased the tightness in her chest and the suffocating stuffiness of the air. The sensation of breathing an outer space atmosphere, not oxygen, but some empty gas. She had eaten no supper or breakfast. For much of the night she had lain awake with her face pressed in the pillow and cried. And when, head throbbing, she opened her eyes late the next morning, to her own bedroom, she lay quietly for several light-headed moments, marveling at the familiar objects, the curtains, the leaf reflections in the dress mirror, even the same pile of overdue library books on the floor. Everything was as she had left it the day she went away to camp. And then it fell on her like a heavy stone that Ida was gone and Libby was dead, and everything was terrible and wrong. Edie, dressed in black with a high collar of pearls, how commanding she looked by the pedestal with the guest book, stood by the door. She was saying the exact same thing to every person who came into the room. The caskets in the back room, she said, by way of greeting to a red-faced man in musty brown who clasped her hands, and then over his shoulder to skinny Mrs. Fawcett, who had tipped up decorously behind to wait her turn. The caskets in the back room. The body's not on view, I'm afraid, but it wasn't my decision. For a moment, Mrs. Fawcett looked confused, then she, too, took Edie's hand. She looked like she was about to cry. I was so sorry to hear, she said. We all love Miss Cleve down at the library. It was the saddest thing this morning when I came in and saw the books I'd put aside for her. Mrs. Fawcett, thought Harriet, with a despairing rush of affection. In the crowd of dark suits, she was a comforting spot of color in her print summer dress and her red canvas espadrilles. I don't know that word, espadrilles. She looked like she'd come straight from work. Edie patted her hand. Well, she was crazy about you all down at the library, too, she said, and Harriet was sickened by her hard, cordial tone. Adelaide and Tat, by the settee opposite Harriet's, were chatting with a pair of stout older ladies who looked like sisters. They were talking about the flowers in the funeral chapel, which, through negligence on the part of the funeral home, had been allowed to wilt overnight. At this, the stout ladies cried aloud with dismay. Looks like the maids or something would have watered them, exclaimed the larger and jollier of the two, apple-cheeked, rotund with curly white hairs like Mrs. Santa. Oh, said Adelaide coolly, with a toss of her chin, they couldn't take the trouble to do that. And Harriet was pierced by an unbearable stab of hatred for Addie, for Edie, for all the old ladies at their brisk expertise in the protocol of sorrow. Right beside Harriet stood another blithe group of chatting ladies. Harriet didn't know any of them except Mrs. Wilder Whitfield, the church organist. A moment before they had been laughing out loud as if they were at a card party, but now they had put their heads together and settled in to talking in hushed voices. Olivia Vanderpool, murmured a bland, smooth-faced woman. Well, Olivia lingered for years. At the end, she was 75 pounds and couldn't take solid food. Poor Olivia, she was never the same after that second fall. They say bone cancer is the worst. Absolutely. All I can say is that it's a blessing little Miss Cleve slipped away so quickly, since she didn't have anybody. Didn't have anybody, thought Harriet. Libby. Mrs. Whitfield noticed Harriet glaring at her and smiled, but Harriet turned her face away and stared at the carpet with red, brimming eyes. She'd cried so much since the ride home from camp that she felt numb, nauseated, unable to swallow. The night before, when she finally fell asleep, she dreamed about insects, a furious black swarm pouring out of an oven in someone's house. Who's that child belong to? The smooth-faced woman asked Mrs. Whitfield in a stage whisper. Ah, said Mrs. Whitfield as her voice dropped. In the dimness, light from the hurricane lanterns splashed and winked through Harriet's tears. Everything a haze now, all melting. Part of her, cold, furious, stood apart and mocked herself for crying as the candle flame dissolved and leapt up in wicked prisms. The funeral home on Main Street, near the Baptist church, was in a tall Victorian house that bristled with turrets and spiky iron crestwork. How many times had Harriet ridden her bicycle by, wondering what went on up in those turrets, behind the cupolas and hooded windows. Occasionally at night, after a death, a mysterious light wavered in the highest tower behind the stained glass, a light which made her think of an article about mummies she'd seen in an old National Geographic. Embalmer priests labored long into the night, read the caption beneath the picture. Karnak, after dark, a spooky light burning to prepare their pharaohs for the long voyage into the underworld. Whenever the tower light burned, Harriet felt a chill down the backbone. Pedaled a little faster home, or in the early winter, on the way home from choir practice, pulled her coat close about her and nestled down in the back seat of Edie's car. Ding dong, the castle bell, sang the girls, jumping rope on the church lawn after choir. Farewell to my mother. Lay me in the boneyard beside my oldest brother. My brother! Whatever nocturnal rites took place upstairs, whatever slashing and draining and stuffing of loved ones, the downstairs was sunk in a sedative Victorian creepiness. In the parlors and reception rooms, the proportions were grand and shadowy, the carpet thick and rusty, the furniture spool-turned chairs, obsolete love seats, dingy and stiff. A velvety rope barred the bottom of the staircase, red carpet, retiring gradually into horror film darkness. The mortician was a cordial little man named Mr. Makepeace, with long arms and a long, thin, delicate nose, and a leg that dragged from polio. He was cheerful and talkative, well-liked despite his job. Across the room, he limped from group to conversational group, a deformed dignitary, shaking hands, always smiling, always welcomed. People stepping to the side, ushering him decorously into conversations. His distinctive silhouette, the angle of the dragged leg, and his habit, every so often, of seizing his thigh with both hands and wrenching it forward when his bad leg got stuck. All this made Harriet think of a picture she'd seen in one of Healy's horror comics of the hunched manor house servant wrenching his leg forcibly with both hands from the skeletal grip of a fiend reaching up to seize it from below. All morning, Edie had been talking about what a good job Mr. Makepeace had done. She'd wanted to go ahead and have an open coffin funeral, even though Libby had repeated urgently all her life that she didn't want her body viewed after she was dead. In life, Edie had scoffed at these fears. In death, she disregarded Libby's wishes and chosen both coffin and clothing with an eye to display, because the out-of-town relatives would expect it, because it was the custom, the thing to do. But this morning, Adelaide and Teddy had raised such a hysterical fuss in the back room of the funeral home that finally Edie had snapped, "Oh, for heaven's sake," and told Mr. Makepeace to shut the lid. Beneath the strong perfume of the lilies, Harriet noticed a different smell. It was a chemical smell like mothballs, but more sickly. Embalming fluid? It did not do to think about such things. It was better not to think at all. Lippy had never explained to Harriet why she was so opposed to open casket funerals, but Harriet had overheard Taddy telling someone that back when they were girls, sometimes these country undertakers did a very poor job. Back before electric refrigeration, our mothers died in the summer, you know. Edie's voice rose clear for a moment in her place by the guest book above the other voices. Well, those people didn't know Daddy then. He never bothered with any such. White gloves, discreet murmurs like a DAR meeting, the very air musty, choking, stuck in Harriet's lungs. Taddy, arms folded, shaking her head, was talking to a tiny little bald man that Harriet didn't know, and despite the fact that she was dark under the eyes and without lipstick, her manner was oddly businesslike and cold. No, she was saying. No, it was old Mr. Holt. Live Fever gave Daddy that nickname back when they were boys. Mr. Holt was walking down the street with his nursemaid when he broke free and jumped on Daddy, and Daddy fought back, of course. And Mr. Holt, he was 3 times the size, broke down crying. Why, you're just an old bully. I often heard my father call the judge that, bully. Well, it wasn't a nickname that suited Daddy, really. He wasn't a large man. Though he did put on weight in those years, those last years, with the phlebitis and his ankles swollen, he couldn't get around like he once had. Harriet bit the inside of her cheek. When Mr. Holt was out of his mind, Tat said, there at the last, Violet told me that every now and then he'd clear up and ask, I wonder where old Bully is. I haven't seen old Bully for a while. Of course, Daddy had been dead for years. There was one afternoon, he kept on so about it, fretting about Daddy and wondering why he hadn't been in so long, that finally Violet told him, Bully stopped by, Holt, and he wanted to see you, but you were asleep. Bless his heart, said the bald man, who was looking over Tat's shoulder at a couple coming into the room. Harriet sat very, very still. Libby, she felt like screaming the way she screamed aloud for Libby, even now, sometimes when she woke in the dark from a nightmare. Lily, whose eyes watered at the doctor's office. Libby, afraid of bees. Her eyes met Allison's, red, brimming with misery. Harriet clamped her lips shut and dug her fingernails into her palms and glared at the carpet, holding her breath with great concentration. 5 days before she died, Libby had been in the hospital. A little while before the end, it had even seemed as if she might wake, mumbling in her sleep, turning the phantom pages of a book before her words became too incoherent to understand, and she slipped down into a white fog of drugs and paralysis. Her signs were failing, and the nurse who'd come in to check her that final morning while Edie was sleeping on a cot beside her bed. There was just enough time to call Adelaide and Tat to the hospital, and then, at a little before 8, with all 3 of her sisters gathered around the bed, her breath got slower and slower, and then, said Tat, with a wry little smile, they just stopped. They'd had to cut her rings off. Her hands were so swollen, Libby's little hands so papery and delicate, beloved little speckled hands, hands that folded paper boats and set them to float on the dish basin, swollen like grapefruits. That was the phrase, the awful phrase that Edie had repeated more than once in the past days. Swollen like grapefruits. Had to call the jewelry store to cut the rings off her fingers. Why didn't you call me? Said Harriet, staggered, dumbfounded when at last she was able to speak. Her voice, in the air-conditioned chill of Edie's new car, had squeaked up high and inappropriate beneath the black avalanche which had crushed her nearly senseless at the words, Libby's dead. Well, said Edie philosophically, I figured why ruin your good time before I had to. Poor little girl, said a familiar voice, Tat's up above them. Allison, her face in her hands, began to sob. Harriet clenched her teeth. She's the only one sadder than me, she thought. The only other really sad person in this room. Don't cry. Tat's school teacherly hand rested for a moment on Allison's shoulder. Libby wouldn't want you to. She sounded upset. A little, noted Harriet coldly in the small, hard part of her which stood back and watched, untouched by grief. But not upset enough. Why, thought Harriet, blind and sore and dazed from weeping, why did they leave me at that stinking camp while Libby was in the bed dying? Edie in the car had apologized, sort of. We thought she was going to be all right, she said. She'd said at first, and then I thought you'd rather remember her the way she was, and finally I wasn't thinking. Girls, Tat said, do you remember our cousins Dell and Lucinda from Memphis? Two slumpy old lady figures stepped forward, one tall and tan, the other round and black with a jeweled black velvet purse. I declare, said the tall, tan one. She stood like a man in her large flat shoes and her hands in the pockets of her khaki shirt waist dress. Bless their hearts, murmured the little dark fat one, dabbing at her eyes, which were rimmed in black like a silent movie star's, with a pink tissue. Harriet stared at them and thought about the pool at the country club, the blue light, how absolutely soundless was the world when she slipped underwater on a deep breath. You can be there now, she told herself. You can be there if you think hard enough. Harriet, may I borrow you for a minute? Adelaide, who was looking very smart in her funeral black with the white collar, grasped her hand and pulled her up. Only if you promise to bring her right back, said the little round lady, wagging a heavily beringed finger. You can leave here. In your mind, just go away. What was it? Peter Pan said to Wendy. Just close your eyes and think lovely thoughts. Oh, in the center of the room, Adelaide stopped dead. Closed her eyes. People swept by them. Music from an invisible organ. Near, my God, to thee. Nothing very thrilling, but Harriet could never tell what the old ladies might find exciting, played ponderously, not far off. Tuberoses, Adelaide exhaled, and the line of her nose in profile was so like Libby's that Harriet's heart squeezed disagreeably tight. Smell that? She caught Harriet's hand and tugged her over to a large flower arrangement in a china urn. The organ music was fake. In an alcove behind the pier table, Harriet spied a reel-to-reel tape recorder ticking away behind a velvet drapery. My favorite flower, Adelaide urged her forward. See the tiny ones? Smell them, honey. Harriet's stomach fluttered. The fragrance in the overheated room was extravagant and deathly sweet. Aren't they heavenly? Adelaide was saying. I had those in my wedding bouquet. Something flickered in front of Harriet's eyes and everything got black around the edges. The next thing she knew, the lights were whirling and big fingers, a man's, had grasped her elbow. I don't know about fainting, but they sure do give me a headache in a closed room, someone was saying. Let her have some air, said the stranger, who was holding her up. An old man, unusually tall, with white hair and bushy black eyebrows. Despite the heat, he was wearing a V-necked sweater vest over his shirt and tie. Out of nowhere, Edie swooped down, all in black like the Wicked Witch, and into Harriet's face. Chill green eyes sized her up coldly for an instant or two. Then she stood up and up and up, and said, take her out to the car. I'll take her, said Adelaide. She stepped around and took Harriet's left arm as the old man, who was very old, in his 80s or maybe even his 90s, took her right, and together they led Harriet out of doors into the blinding sunlight, very slowly, more at the old man's pace than Harriet's, woozy though she felt. Harriet, said Adelaide stagily, and squeezed her hand. I bet you don't know who this is. This is Mr. J. Rhodes Sumner that had a place just down the road from where I grew up. Chipoke, said Mr. Sumner, inflating himself grandly. Certainly, Chipoke's. Right down the road from Tribulation. I know you've heard us all talk about Mr. Sumner, Harriet. That went to Egypt with the Foreign Service. I knew your Aunt Addie when she was just a little baby girl. Adelaide laughed flirtatiously. Not that little, Harriet. Not that little. Harriet, I thought you'd like to talk to Mr. Sumner because you're so interested in King Tut and all. I wasn't in Cairo long, said Mr. Sumner. Only during the war. Everybody and his brother was in Cairo then. He shuffled up to the open passenger window of a long black Cadillac limousine, the funeral home limo, and stooped a little to speak to the driver. Will you look after this young lady here? She's going to lie down in the back seat for a few minutes. The driver, whose face was as white as Harriet's, though he had a gigantic rust-red afro, started and switched off the radio. What, he said, glancing from side to side and not knowing where to look first, at the tottery old white man leaning in his window, or at Harriet climbing into the back. She ain't feeling well? Tell you what, said Mr. Sumner, stooping down to peer into the dark interior after Harriet. It looks like this thing might have a bar in it. The driver seemed to shake himself and perk up. No, sir, boss. That's my other car, he said in a jokey, indulgent, artificially friendly tone. Mr. Sumner appreciatively slapped the car's roof as he laughed along with the driver. All right, he said. His hands were trembling. Though he seemed sharp enough, he was one of the oldest and frailest people Harriet had ever seen up and walking around. All right. You're doing all right for yourself, ain't you? Can't complain. Glad to hear it. Now, girl, he said to Harriet, what do you require? Would you like a Coca-Cola? Oh, John, she heard Adelaide murmur. She doesn't need it. John, Harriet stared right ahead. I just want you to know that I loved your Aunt Libby better than anything in the world, she heard Mr. Sumner say. His voice was old and quavery and very southern. I would have asked that girl to marry me if I thought she'd have me. Tears welled infuriatingly in Harriet's eyes. She pressed her lips tight and tried not to cry. The inside of the car was suffocating. Mr. Sumner said, after your greatest granddaddy died, I did ask Libby to come on and marry me, old as we both were then, he chuckled. Know what she said? When he couldn't catch Harriet's eye, he tapped lightly on the car door. Know what she said, honey? She reckoned she might be able to do it if she didn't have to get on an airplane. Ha ha ha! Just to give you an idea, young lady, I was working down in Venezuela at the time. Behind, Adelaide said something. The old man said under his breath, darn if she ain't Edith all over again. Adelaide laughed coquettishly, and at this, Harriet's shoulders began to heave of their own accord, and the sobs burst forth unwilling. Ah, cried Mr. Sumner, with genuine distress. His shadow in the car window fell across her again. Bless her little heart. No, 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 said Adelaide, firmly leading her away. Leave her alone. She'll be fine, John. The car's door still stood open. Harriet's sobs were loud and repugnant in the silence. Up front, the limousine driver observed her silently in the rear view mirror. Over the top of a drugstore paperback astrology wheel on the cover, entitled Your Love Signs, presently, he inquired, Yo mama Yo mama die? Oh my God. Yo mama die? Harriet shook her head. In the mirror, the driver raised an eyebrow. I say yo mama. No. Yo mama die? I mean, imagine someone saying that to you. God damn. Well, then, he punched in the cigarette lighter. You ain't got nothing to cry about. The cigarette lighter clicked out, and the driver lit his cigarette and blew a long breath of smoke in the open. Yo mama died of smoke out the open window. You don't know what sadness he said till that day. Then he opened the glove compartment and handed her a few tissues across the seat. Who died then? He asked. Yo daddy? My aunt. Oh, my aunt, Harriet managed to say, yo what? My aunt. Oh, yo auntie. Silence. You live with her? After waiting patiently for some moments, the driver shrugged and turned back to the front where he sat quietly with his elbow out the open window, smoking his cigarette. Every so often, he looked down at his book, which he held open beside his right thigh with one hand. When you born? He asked Harriet after a while. What month? December, said Harriet, just as he'd started to ask her a second time. December? He glanced over the seat at her. His face was doubtful. You a Sagittaria? Capricorn. Capricorn. His laugh was rather unpleasant and insinuating. You a little goat, then. Ha, ha, ha. Across the street at the Baptist church, the bells chimed noon. Their icy, mechanical peal brought back one of Harriet's earliest memories. Libby, fall afternoon, vivid sky, red and yellow leaves in the gutter, stooping beside Harriet in her red parka. Her hands around Harriet's waist. Listen, and together they had listened in the cold. Bright air, a minor note which rang out unchanged a decade later, chilly and sad as a note struck on a child's toy piano. A note that even in summertime sounded like bare tree branches and skies in winter and lost things. You mind if I put on the radio? Said the driver. When Harriet did not reply for crying, he switched it on anyway. You got a boyfriend? He inquired. Out on the street, a car honked. Yo, called the limo driver, flashing a palm at it, and Harriet, electrified, sat up rigid as Danny Ratliff's eyes struck her own and flared with recognition. She saw her shock mirrored on his face. The next instant, he was gone, and she was staring after the indecently cocked rear of the Trans Am. Say, I say, repeated the driver, and with a start, Harriet realized that he was leaning over the seat looking at her. You got a boyfriend? Harriet tried to look after the Trans Am without appearing to, and saw it turn left a few blocks ahead toward the train station and the old freight yards. Across the street, the church bell, on the last dying note of its carol, struck the hour with sudden violence. Dong, 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 dong. You stuck up, said the driver. His voice was teasing and coquettish. Ain't you? All of a sudden, it occurred to Harriet that he might turn around and come back. She glanced up at the front steps of the funeral home. There were several people milling about, a group of old men smoking cigarettes, Adelaide and Mr. Sumner standing off to the side. Mr. Sumner bent over her solicitously. Was he lighting a cigarette for her? Addie hadn't smoked in years, but there she was, arms crossed, throwing her head back like a stranger, blowing out a plume of smoke. Boys don't like no stuck-up acting girl, the driver was saying. Harriet got out of the car. The door was still open, and walked up the steps of the funeral home fast. And that's going to be it for that portion. And then I think there's like 16 pages left in this chapter. And I will finish them at some other point since it's in the middle of the fucking night at this point. All right, Bobs, that's all. Goodbye.